My name is Chris Thorogood. I'm a botanist and a botanical illustrator, and it's my pleasure today to be giving you a mini masterclass in the art of botanical illustration using watercolours. Our subject today is going to be this, a succulent aeonium. Now succulents are really good subjects, especially for beginners, because the leaves don't have too many intricate or fussy details, not lots of veins. That said, they do have some details that we're going to pay close attention to, and that really is what botanical illustration is all about. It's about capturing the form, the details and the colour of the specimen. We'll need some paints. So I particularly like using boxes of paints because it means they're portable and I can paint wherever I choose. But a lot of people choose to paint with tubes, and that's fine too. We'll need some brushes, and we'll need a range of sizes, but particularly fine ones which make a nice point when they're wet, and those are great for capturing botanical details which are important. And we'll need some special paper. So I've got some hot pressed, very thick paper here that's super smooth on the surface, which again enables you to capture those important details, and the paper can also withstand being wetted several times because normal paper would just disintegrate. So we've got our plant, we've got our paper, and we've got our paints. Let's begin.
So the first thing I always do is wet the paper. This is so important because if I don't do this, the colour will not sit well on the paper. Bearing in mind we're using special watercolour paper, what that means is that it can really withstand a lot of wetting. If you did this on normal paper, it would disintegrate, of course. So I'm just working water into the paper. I tend to use slightly warm water actually. I'm not sure if it makes much difference, but I get the feeling it absorbs better. So I'm just filling the outline that I've prepared in pencil. I don't want to flood the paper, but I don't want to be too conservative either. It really should be quite wet, because that way the colour will just glide on beautifully. And what I've done in the meantime is I've prepared 3 different colours. I've prepared a sort of brown dead leaf colour, a yellowish dying leaf colour, and then a nice fresh green colour. And what I'd like to do is meld those 3 colours so that we've got a leaf that is dying towards the edge but nice and fresh green towards the base. And the colours that I prepared are very pale. They're what we call a tea wash. So think of it as the colour of black or green tea without milk added. That gives you an idea of the consistency. Because we're going to build up so many layers that the colour can be added later. So that's ready to go. And I'm going to start from the edge with my brown. So here we go. Look at how the colour seeps into the wetted area. And these little clouds. Now I'm going to go in with my yellow to about 1/3 of the way down the leaf. By drying your brush intermittently, you can then use it to remove some of the excess colour if you're worried that you've put a bit too much on, which I possibly have here. And then finally, I'm going to add my green to give some life to the leaf. And as these colours dry, they'll start to sort of meld into one another. I'm just going to use my dried brush to remove some of the paint from the middle And as I build up the layers, that will provide a natural highlight that I can work around.
Okay, so now let's leave that to dry.
Okay, so my tea wash is now thoroughly dry, and that's so important because if I were to try and add any more paint when it's wet, it would be a disaster, frankly. So now that it is dry, I'm going to wet it again, just like we did before, and then I'm going to add a glaze to start building up this colour. And can you see how, despite me working at it quite hard with the brush, the colour's fixed? It won't move, and that's what you want. Once it's dry, it becomes fixed in that way.
And that means that you can start to build up layers of colour. So I'm going to go back in with the same colours that I used before, which will start to add colour and depth. So there's the brown. In with the yellow. And then the green, of course. But I'm going to leave a band free in the middle. Take a dry brush and absorb some of that paint. And I'm now going to go in with a slightly darker green along the edge. And as that dries, it will all start to blend in and form a very subtle shadow. Okay, so we're doing well. We've got a few layers of paint on here, and they're starting to look a little bit more like leaves. But I still want to get a little bit more light and dark on them to give them a bit more of a 3D look. So in with another glaze. So yet again, I'm wetting the surface of the leaf. And as always, make sure it's bone dry before you go back to it, because otherwise I'm afraid it will be ruined. Just work the water into the leaf. Now I'm going to go in with some darker colours to really start to bring the leaf to life. So I've loaded my brush with quite a lot more paint now. And I'm working towards the tips. A little bit more yellow. I'm even going to add a tiny bit of orange here, just as a slight highlight. I don't have to worry too much about the edges yet, because I'm going to go back and neaten those later. However, now is a good opportunity, as I'm going to have fewer and fewer layers after this, to start to neaten them up a little bit, I think. Okay, I'm a lot happier with how this is looking now, and I think on the next layer we can start to sharpen up some of the edges and add the detail. Okay, so now I'd like to add some of the finer details.
So I've wet the leaf again, and I've made up a sort of darkish maroon brown paint that's quite thick. And I'm just going to add some markings one by one, particularly along the edges of the leaf. I'm also going to add some little spots. Okay, I think we've made some good progress on this leaf, and once this layer is dry, we can add some of the finer details and do some dry brushwork. Okay, so we've made some really good progress, but you can see there are some really messy lines, particularly where I've used so many wet washes. And so what I now want to do is sharpen up these lines to give these leaves a bit of a sharper finish and for them to be a bit more defined. And how I'm going to do this is I'm going to work on the shadow of the leaves in the background to bring those in front into greater focus. I'm leaving just a tiny white line around each leaf where I can, which will highlight it. Now it's time to crispen up these white lines, which are starting to look a little bit messy. So I've created a sort of fawn coloured mix in which I've actually added some white watercolour paint, which I tend to use very sparingly because it adds an opaqueness which you certainly don't want much of when you're adding your washes. It would be a little bit of a disaster, but at this stage it's very useful for tidying up the lines. Okay, so my lines are sharper, but I do need a finer point at the end of the leaf than I have currently. So I'm going to take a super fine brush and I'm going to add that in. So you can see you really do have to be careful at this stage Can't be doing with undoing all of our hard work to get to this point. Now for some subtlety, I'm going to do some dry brush technique. So I've got a brush just about as dry as you can get it. And just in some of these areas where the colour could potentially be a little bit more intense than it is, I'm just going to work my brush into those corners and also hide some of these imperfections where the water has sat. Pushing the brush against the edges. Now you can see that it won't be super smooth, which is why you have to be very careful not to overdo it at this stage. But it is a useful way of adding some additional colour in places where you think it could do with some lifting. That's probably enough. This is where botanical details become really important. I've got the finest brush imaginable, and now I need to add these tiny little tooth-like markings on the edge of the leaf. It's painstaking, but it's got to be done. Okay, we're nearly done now, but one of the final touches I'd like to do is I'd like to add a little bit of light to the younger leaves at the top, because those are a little bit shinier. And so I've got a relatively dry brush with some white watercolour paint on, which, as I said before, I use very sparingly, because if used in the wrong way it really can ruin a watercolour painting, because it has an opaqueness that isn't really very suited to the medium by and large. That said, it's very useful for just adding that little bit of light and life to leaves at the end.
but do be careful not to overdo it. Very easily done at this stage. Depending on the texture of the leaf, you can make your brush wetter or drier. So if my brush was very dry at the moment, that would give quite a rough texture to the leaf. The wetter my brush, the smoother it becomes. These are quite smooth and waxy, so I don't want my brush to be too dry. If you want a powdery look on a leaf, you can use a completely dry brush, and it has a sort of chalky consistency, but that's not quite what we want here. The other thing you should know about the white paint is that it doesn't seem to fix on the page in the same way that the other colours do. So you can leave it to dry, but if you come back and try and paint over it, it will just all mobilise again, like it was when you put it on wet. In some ways that's good, because if you've made a mistake you can come back to it and remove it, but what you certainly can't do is another glaze on top of the white. I think I might just add a little bit here to highlight that ridge on the leaf. Maybe a tiny bit more on its sister leaf as well. And any more than that, and I think I'm at risk of undoing some of the hard work. So I think we can call that a day for now.